good evening students. In the third video on the blood supply of the brain, this is a presentation on the blood supply of the cerebral cortex. In the last video, in the last two video rather, we have seen that the uh, circle of Willis gives two different kind of branches, that is the central branches, okay, which goes deeper to supply the deep structure of the cerebral hemisphere, and the second set of the branches were the cortical branches, okay, anterior cerebral, middle cerebral and the posterior cerebral arteries, they supply the cerebral cortex. Okay, so this video is for the cortical branches of the cerebral hemisphere, right, and the left cerebral hemisphere. Let's move to the next slide where I will describe the various surfaces of the cerebral cortex, the medial, the lateral, superolateral and the inferior surface, how these three arteries are supplying to the various areas on these three surfaces of the cerebral cortex. Now, if we see the circle of Willis, this is the anterior communicating artery. This is the anterior cerebral artery, which is a branch from this internal carotid artery, where I would say the terminal branch of the internal carotid artery. The second terminal branch is the middle cerebral. That means anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery, they are the terminal branch of this internal carotid artery, while the other branches from the internal carotid artery, before it terminates into this anterior and middle cerebral artery, is the ophthalmic artery, okay, and the second is the anterior choroidal artery. Another artery which goes backward is the posterior communicating artery. So this posterior communicating artery joins the posterior cerebral artery, which itself is a terminal branch of the basilar artery, which lies in front of the pons. So the internal carotid artery and the posterior cerebral artery, they communicate with each other through the posterior communicating artery. And we have seen in the last video that all these arteries, they gives anteromedial, anterolateral, okay, central branches, and the posteromedial and posterolateral central branches. Now in this video we will learn that what are the area of the cerebral hemisphere which is supplied by this artery, that is the anterior cerebral artery. What are the areas of the cerebral cortex which are supplied by this large branch, okay, the middle cerebral artery, and the area supplied by this posterior cerebral artery. So these are the cortical branches which are taking origin from circle of Willis. Now let us see the first surface which we will learn, that is this the medial surface. This is the hemisection of the cerebral cerebral hemisphere, where this is the right cerebral hemisphere. Its medial surface is seen, or the medial aspect of the right cerebral hemisphere is seen. This is the corpus callosum, rostrum, genu, body and the splenium, thalamus, fornix, and this is the lateral ventricle, this is the hypothalamic part, okay, the subthalamic sulcus is here. So this for the orientation. Now this is the cerebral cortex, okay, which lies just in front of the genu, just it lies in above that of the body of the fornix, I would say corpus callosum, and this is the part which lies posterior to the splenium. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus, okay, parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the calcarine sulcus of the occipital lobe. That means this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, and here is the temporal lobe, okay, this part is the temporal lobe. This is the part of the midbrain, okay, the part of the midbrain, pituitary gland, and this is the mammillary bodies, okay, the mammillary. Okay, after this orientation I will tell you that this medial surface or medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere is supplied by the many arteries. Okay, this part up to the parieto-occipital sulcus, that is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe on its medial aspect, surrounding to the corpus callosum, is supplied by this anterior cerebral artery. See this? This is the anterior cerebral artery. Then the occipital, this is the temporal pole here, and a area above the, close to the temporal pole, is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Okay, this is supplied by, which is shown by separate color. And then a large area of the this temporal lobe on its inferior surface, partly and partly on medial aspect, and then this occipital lobe on its medial aspect. These are supplied by the branches from the posterior cerebral artery. So three different cerebral arteries, that is major part is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, a small part by the temporal, and then another large part is supplied by that of the occipital artery. Okay, or the posterior, for the occipital lobe is supplied by the posterior cerebral. So anterior cerebral, the part is middle cerebral to the temporal, and then to the occipital it is the posterior cerebral. So the medial surface is supplied by the three different cerebral arteries. Let's move to the other aspect, and this aspect of the cerebral hemisphere is that of the superolateral surface, as seen from the lateral aspect and superior surface. This is the frontal pole, this is the occipital pole, this is the temporal pole. Okay, so this is the central sulcus, and all the area which lies in front of this central sulcus is the frontal lobe. Between the parieto-occipital sulcus here and the central sulcus, this part is the parietal lobe posterior to an imaginary line here. This area is that of the occipital lobe. It is occipital lobe. And then below this is the stem and the ramus of the lateral sulcus, the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, all the area below up to the occipital, pre-occipital notch and parieto-occipital sulcus, this area is the temporal lobe. So the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, frontal lobe and parietal lobe are the areas which are seen from the superolateral surface, and then different arteries, they are supplying it. This area in this color here, which is shown here near the superior border, okay, this is supplied by that of the anterior cerebral artery, and all this area here extending from the this temporal pole right up to the occipital pole here, the whole area of the occipital lobe on superolateral surface is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery, and the central part, which is adjacent to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, it is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Now some of the anastomotic arteries between the middle cerebral and the occipital may be present here, so the blood from the middle may go towards the occipital pole through the branches of the occipital, the posterior cerebral artery, not occipital but the posterior cerebral. Similarly, some of the anastomotic branches between the anterior and that of the middle cerebral artery will supply this area, which is close to the supromedial border. Okay, so you have understood the superolateral surface, but this area is very important, superolateral, because there is the area, Broca's area of the motor speech. Okay, and then here is the auditory area in the superior temporal gyrus. Here is the Wernicke's area, speech area, sensory speech area is here. The post-central gyrus is the primary sensory area, and the precentral gyrus is the primary motor area. It is the primary motor. So very important areas are located on the superolateral surface, which I will tell you when I will come to the applied importance of the middle cerebral arteries. Okay, moving to the next slide. This is the third surface which is seen from the inferior aspect, and if we see the inferior aspect of cerebral hemisphere, this is that of the left cerebral hemisphere inferior aspect, we will see that again this is supplied by all the three cerebral arteries, so that you have seen that the medial aspect, the inferior aspect and superolateral aspect of each cerebral hemisphere on right and left side is supplied by all the three cerebral artery, anterior, middle and posterior. Okay, so here this is the anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so this area is supplied by an inferior aspect by the anterior cerebral artery, and this area, that is the orbital surface of the frontal lobe, and here the orbital surface are the pole, that is the temporal pole of this temporal lobe, and the area in the tentorial surface of the occipital lobe and part of this temporal lobe, it is supplied by the posterior cerebral. You can see the whole extent of this posterior cerebral artery, a large extent, not the whole extent, and these are the branches taking origin from the middle cerebral. So this narrow area near the midline is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, the frontal and this tentorial, and say this area, that is the temporal area. Here it is on the tentorial surface is supplied by the middle cerebral artery, and then the large area of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Thus we have seen that all the three cerebral arteries, they are supplying all the three surfaces of this each cerebral hemisphere. Okay, now let us see that these cerebral cortical branches, okay, which are supplying to the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. See here, this is the middle cerebral artery, and its branches, they are penetrating also not only to the gray matter, but they are also penetrating to certain extent deeper. The posterior cerebral is here, anterior cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery, and this is the middle cerebral artery. This is the ramus of the lateral, posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Now you can see that some of the central branches which takes origin, they along with the cortical branches, they go to the deeper structure. For example, here is one of the branch from the middle cerebral artery, which is called as the anterior choroidal artery, okay, plus the posterior cerebral artery. Here they are sending the central branches, okay, central branches, and here from the middle cerebral artery, these central branches are going deep. Similarly, from the anterior cerebral artery, this anteromedial cerebral branch, central branches are going, and similarly from the posterior cerebral artery too, right from, I'm saying, both cortical as well as center. But most of the central branches which arise from the middle cerebral artery, they are responsible for supply to the lentiform nucleus, to the thalamus, to the caudate nucleus, and to the internal capsule. Between thalamus and this lentiform nucleus, this white area is the internal capsule. So these central branches of three cerebral artery plus central branches of the anterior choroidal artery, which is a branch from the internal carotid artery, they supply the deeper structure. That means mass of the gray matter, deep nuclei, okay, including thalamus, hypothalamus, okay, corpus striatum, that is say the caudate nucleus, and the lentiform nucleus and the internal capsule, they are all supplied. This is shown in a cross section, say coronal section, and you can see these areas of supply in the coronal section. This is for the anterior cerebral artery, this area is for the middle cerebral artery, this is for the anterior choroidal artery, and this area is for the posterior. So in the cross section also, deeper part, we can see the presence of the the area supplied by this central branches. While in this horizontal section, okay, you can also see again the deeper part, anterior cerebral artery. This large area is the middle cerebral artery. This is the blue is the posterior cerebral artery, and this violet here is that of the branches from the central branches from the anterior choroidal artery. Thus, we have seen the deeper structures are supplied mostly by the central artery, but the cortical artery may also send deeper branches. They are not only meant for supply to the cerebral cortex, but also for supply to that of the deeper branches. Let's move to the next slide, and here now we will learn what will happen if the anterior cerebral artery gets occluded. Occlusion may be due to the thrombosis, embolus formation, and there may be the other region, or maybe rupture, okay, maybe rupture. So if the occlusion takes place of the anterior cerebral artery, okay, most of the part of the anterior cerebral arteries are seen here. You can see this is an anterior cerebral artery, and if this artery gets occluded, all this area of the frontal and that of the parietal lobe on its medial surface will not get the blood. That is, the gray matter of these lobes will not get the blood supply. So this occlusion will lead to the loss of sensory and motor supply to the opposite leg and foot. See here in this diagram, this is the foot which is represented on medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, then the leg up to the knee joint it is, and a large area of the perineum, okay, genitalias where are located right from knee and genitalia to the foot. All this area is present on this medial, and where it is present, the motor part is present in the upturned part of the precentral gyrus, and then the sensory to the upturned part of the postcentral gyrus, okay. So these areas are located, these areas, both sensory as well as motor area, as shown in this diagram. They will not be getting, I mean to say, the motor supply, okay, motor supply, and this will lead to the loss of sensory and motor loss of the leg and foot, leg up to the knee joint, okay, leg and foot. So there will take place the paralysis, okay, and sensory loss of the opposite lower limb, because these fibers they cross to the opposite side, motor in the pyramidal decussation and sensory, okay, they cross to the opposite side at the spinal level. So this is the applied importance of the anterior cerebral artery. So if the occlusion of anterior cerebral artery, the opposite leg is going to suffer. That means below the knee joint, both motor as well as the movements are weak or not there. Okay, complete paralysis may be there, and loss of sensation, pain, touch, and temperature. Right? Let us go to the next slide. Occlusion of the cortical branch of middle cerebral. So from anterior we are now coming to the middle cerebral artery, and if you see the area supplied by the middle cerebral artery and the branches, they come out from the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The whole of this posterolateral surface in its central part is supplied by the middle cerebral arteries, okay. Cortical, we are talking not central but cortical branches of the middle cerebral artery. So since here area number 4 is here just in front of the central sulcus, and this is the primary motor area, then area number 6 will come, then area number 8. They are all related to the motor activity here, okay. Motor and premotor areas are here, and posterior to the central sulcus is area number 3, 1 and 2, and this is the primary sensory area, okay, primary sensory, and all the motor and sensory area just above the knee joint, that is to the thigh, to the trunk, to the neck, to the head, to the upper limb, and to the hands, then the face and larynx, okay. They all are supply, I mean to say, represented here into the central I mean to say sulcus, say in front of the central sulcus for motor and posterior to the central sulcus for sensory activity. So body is represented here upside down, and any occlusion of the middle cerebral artery will lead to the loss of the motor and sensory, okay, loss. In the opposite half of the body, as we have seen of the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, similarly on superolateral it is the opposite. As I said that the motor fibers will cross at the pyramidal decussation, and sensory fibers they cross to the opposite side at the level of the spinal cord itself. Now this loss of motor and sensory loss will be above the leg, as I have explained in this diagram. So this because above the knee joint, this area, the whole of the body above is represented here on superolateral surface in the post-central gyrus and the primary motor areas, okay, precentral gyrus. So motor and sensory area of the speech. Let us come here, because this artery will also supply to the motor area, that is the Broca's area 44 and 45, motor speech area, okay. This is the motor speech area of the Broca, and then here is the superior temporal gyrus, there is the Wernicke's area, and it is the sensory speech area. So both motor and sensory speech area will be lost, and because of that a person will not be able to speak, and that condition is called as aphasia, okay, aphasia. But this will be possible when there is occlusion of the middle cerebral artery in the left cerebral hemisphere, because left cerebral hemisphere is considered to be a dominant cerebral hemisphere in right-handed person. In the right-handed, the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant. So if the occlusion of the middle cerebral artery is into the left side, then only this motor and sensory speech area or aphasia will result. Aphasia will, otherwise if it is in the right cerebral hemisphere, they will be spared, okay. The aphasia will not take place, okay, not takes place. But there is another important area number 41 is, I am moving my cursor on that, it is on the superior temporal gyrus, and this is for hearing, okay. So there will be loss of the hearing will be also there, but this will be a partial loss, because the other hearing area on the opposite cerebral hemisphere is still intact, hence there will be the partial loss. So these are the effect which are quite major effect for the occlusion of the cortical branches of the middle cerebral artery. Now, the occlusion of this middle cerebral artery, as I said, will lead ultimately to the hemiplegia in upper half of the body, above the knee joint, in upper half of the body, with the sensory loss, hemisensory deficit, and aphasia of the left lobe, if left lobe is involved. That means what kind of aphasia? Both motor as well as sensory. If you will show an apple to a patient of this aphasia, he will not be able to name it, because he cannot recognize it as an apple, and he cannot able to speak as it as an apple. There is a both loss of the speech, which is motor speech, as well as the sensory speech. Similarly, there is the opposite half of the body will be paralyzed, okay, as well as there will be the sensory loss will take place, okay. Let us come to the last cerebral artery, that is the posterior cerebral artery occlusion, and here the main area which is to be supplied, a functional area, is that of the visual area, visual cortex, area number 70. So the posterior cerebral artery, it will supply to that of the cerebral cortex, surrounding to that is area 17, 18 and 19 area. That means the complete visual area is supplied by this posterior cerebral artery, and because of that there will be the loss of the vision, okay, in both the eyes, but it will be the half the visual field in one eye, and another half of the visual field blindness will take place into the another eye, because the cerebral cortex of one side, area number 70, it is getting the fibers from both the eyes. So the nasal half and the parietal half, say for example, and this kind of the visual loss is called as hemianopia. It is called as the hemianopia. So the posterior cerebral artery occlusion will lead to the hemisensory deficit. Involvement of the thalamus also will be there. So hemisensory deficit may be there because of the involvement of the thalamus, which is the relay station for all the sensory impulses, and there will be hemianopia, that is the supply of the visual cortex will be lost, okay, yeah, in the calcarine sulcus, okay. But this will be with the macula sparing. What is macula sparing? That means there will be visual field will be lost, but that area of the I mean to say retina, macular area of the retina will be spared, and this is represented at the occipital pole. And because there may be an fair anastomosis between the branches of the posterior cerebral artery for this visual area, but near the occipital pole there may be an anastomosis between these occipital artery branches with the middle cerebral artery, and that's why the area of the occipital pole, that is which is representing the macular area, can be spared. There will be no blindness in the area of the macula. That is called as the macular I mean to say sparing. This complete the I mean to say a blood supply of the cerebral cortex with the help of the three cortical branches of circle of Willis, anterior, medial and posterior cerebral arteries, and I have covered the clinical application of these three cerebral artery. I thank you very much for watching this video.